Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this is my Spicy 273 project. In a previous Engine Wednesday video a couple weeks ago, I went over all the finer details of this build. I also assembled the pistons and rods, checked ring gaps, and things like that. I've had some comments that I guess I'm going to take into consideration, and then it's time to build this thing. I wasn't planning to do an assembly video on this one. I've done multiple small block build videos in the past, and I don't want to repeat myself. However, there seems to be some interest in it, so I'm going to go ahead and point a camera at this engine while I'm bolting it together. As you saw in the intro there, I bought a new case of brake clean and used at least a couple dollars worth of it to clean this block as thoroughly as I can. Now I'm pretty much ready to drop the crank in. While I was cleaning it, I did remember something. For this build, I had been planning to institute some oiling system modifications. One thing I would have liked to have done is clean up the drain back holes. Thing is, the block's already machined and done, and the last thing I want to do is fill it with little bits of cast iron dust, so that ship has sailed. There's even more than that. One modification involves changing the size of the main bearing oil feed holes, and another involves blocking off the feed hole to the other bank that comes from a main bearing here, and then adding a crossover line. Again, I guess we're not doing that this time. In the future, these are certainly things I'm going to be considering. At the end of the day, this engine is unlikely to make 400 horsepower, despite the optimistic predictions of some commenters on the previous video. And while I do plan to spin it above 6,000 RPM, it's never going to be there for very long, because drag racer. So I'm hopeful that none of these modifications are really necessary and everything's going to be fine. We're going to find out together though. I couldn't start assembling this engine at the end of the last video because it didn't have gaskets yet. I've since gotten this Felpro full engine gasket set with part number 260-1152. I looked this up for a mid-80s Dodge truck through O'Reilly. They show the correct A-body kits as no longer available, but this kit seems to have everything I need. In fact, it has a whole lot more than I need. We've got multiple intake gaskets here I won't be using, exhaust manifold gaskets I won't be using, cork end seals I won't be using, a goofy thermostat gasket I'm probably not going to use either, another version of the oil filter adapter, some crappy rubberized fiber stupid valve cover gaskets, and also valve seals. Okay, I might use the valve seals. I'm actually kind of hoping not to use these head gaskets either, because as discussed in the previous video, these have the gigantic combustion ring to fit the 340, and on our 273, that'll cost us like half a compression point. I am pleased to see the proper surround gasket for the 90-degree oil filter adapter included in here, as you can see in this kit we got for Mark's engine, but the cork and the copper washer thingy for the bolt are not included. Mail, sure. They're made in America. These are the main bearings for this engine, and like all other main bearings, they need to be cleaned right out of the package. They look pretty nice. Again, these are half-groove bearings, and I'm just going to run them. Probably beating a dead horse here, explaining how important it is to clean your engine parts before they go in your engine. But that's what came off of the number 5 main bearing that I just pulled out of this fresh package. Grooved sections of the bearings are now in the block. These, of course, are the upper shells, even though the block is upside down. Up is that way. Now we're ready to drop a crank in, but first we need a rear main seal. The block half gets installed just like this, with the lip facing inward. Note, it is flush here with the block. In fact, it's a little bit proud. There's just enough material there to squish against the lower half and seal. I will be hitting this with a little bit of silicone, not much. And here's the lower half installed in the rear main cap. Very nice. Main caps are cleaned, bearinged, and ready to go. Gave the crank a quick bath and blew through all the oil passages. Oiled the main bearings. Don't forget the thrust surfaces. And dropped the crank in place. Oil the main bolts. Unless you're using ARP hardware, in which case ARP lube the main hardware. Drop the main caps on one by one, ensuring that the tang of the bearing in the cap matches with the tang of the bearing in the block. Start these bolts and tap that cap with a hammer, carefully. Done. There are caps numbers 1 through 4 in place. Number 2 and 4, of course, have the bolts with a little shoulder piece to mount the windage tray, and number 3 has our thrust surface. And there's some carefully applied silicone for the rear main seal in cap number 5. So far, main bolts are just snug. Now it's time to set and verify the crankshaft thrust. Thrust means the movement fore and aft of the crankshaft itself. It has to be able to move a little bit, but it shouldn't be able to move too much, especially in this application where we're going to have a big heavy clutch behind this thing pushing on the thrust surfaces. We need to verify that this is at least correct to begin with. To do this, I'm first going to gently tap this flathead screwdriver between this crank throw and the block. This will bring the crank all the way forward and should square the thrust bearing surfaces here in the number 3 cap and in the block above it by forcing them this way with the thrust surface of the crank. Now we can torque this cap to its first stage, 35 foot-pounds or so, and then we'll verify the thrust. This is also known as crankshaft end play. We certainly have some, judging by this noise. I'm going to grab a dial indicator with a magnetic base and we'll verify what the number is. With the crank all the way rearward, I zeroed the dial. Now pulling it forward. Looks like 5 thousandths, which is actually a little bit tight. Had to give myself a quick refresher on the acceptable end play range. Apparently it's 4 to 10 thousandths. So at 5, again, we're on the tighter side of that, but I think this is going to be just fine. And now all the main fasteners are torqued, and you can tell that because I marked them with a paint dot. These go to 85 foot-pounds. I do these in 3 stages. I started at 35, then 60, then 85. Here's what our crank spins like now. Very, very nice. Now, if I were a real engine builder, before I assembled this, I would have verified the oil clearance for these main bearings. It's essential that that's correct. However, in my experience, it usually is. This is a factory-sized crankshaft that's had a nice polish job, and that set of Cleveite male, whatever, bearings feels good, so I think that means it is good. The right thing to do here would be to measure. And yes, I could get some of that plastic gauge stuff and squish it in there and compare it to a chart, but I don't wanna. And now it's rod and piston time, but first, we need to cover a few things. First thing, I mentioned in the last video that these pistons are labeled left and right. My thinking at the beginning of the video was that they would be left bank and right bank, but I didn't actually think they were different left and right. The reason they are different from bank to bank is because these have an offset pin. Most factory pistons did at this time. It's pretty hard to see on here because this doesn't have the typical flat areas around the pin. But yeah, the rod is offset ever so slightly. This is supposed to help reduce noise. According to Uncle Tony, if you flip your pistons around when they have the offset pins, this can actually increase horsepower. While I've seen various dyno tests that seem to indicate that is not the case, I don't think there's any downside to doing this, especially for a race engine. What do I care if it makes more noise? So I probably am going to put them in backwards. For science. As I was assembling rods and pistons in the last video, I attempted to explain how I knew I was getting them correct, but I failed to do that right. These are the bearing tangs, and on a given side of the engine you're standing on, the tangs will face the oil pan rail. So we know that the valve reliefs go up and the tangs go out. Now note, I am flipping these right for left, but it doesn't matter because either way, it's going to be correct. Tangs out, valve reliefs up on the driver's side bank. Tangs out, valve reliefs up on the passenger side bank. I am going to mark these with a paint pen before I install them, rod and cap. I don't know if those marks will be visible in the future, but I don't know, it gives me the warm and fuzzies. I do have a set of number punches, but I don't want to punch these rods. I feel like that could damage them and do bad stuff. Now for the big one, the wire clips that retain the pins. Many commenters said I should just get rid of these because they're terrible and they can pop out. I thought about it, but I couldn't get spiral locks quickly, and I really want to get this thing together. I also don't want to spend any more money. I did dig around in my collection and I don't have any. I have more of these, and I have the factory type wire clips, which are very much like this. I'm going to go ahead and run them. I will heed a little bit of advice, which was put the opening upward or downward. Apparently the forces of the moving piston can squish the clip. If they're turned this way, it's easier for that to happen, I guess. So I will go ahead and point these openings upward. The concern is that under heavy use, these factory type retainers could pop out and then the pin and or the clip could gouge the crap out of a cylinder wall. Obviously, we don't want that to happen, so I will take this extra precautionary step, but I choose not to worry about it too much. It's a little while later, and all of the rods and pistons were cleaned. The clips are now flipped, and they're all numbered and ready for installation. Piston number 1 is dropped in place. I showed in a previous assembly video a technique of compressing the rings by hand, and that does work, but I've reverted to using a ring compressor. It's a little bit easier. Although I will tell you, I'm no longer using it for the oil control rings. I get them to go in just using the taper on the bore. Then I compress the top two, and it goes super fast. I can't tell you how many oil control ring rails have gotten stuck between this thing and the head surface over the years while I've been trying to assemble engines. It's kind of why I wanted to try to go without it. Anyway, I've got the cap already tapped in place. Now it's time to install these rod bolts, which do already have the ARP lube on them. Now these use a 12.7/16 socket to tighten. I've just got them snug now. We'll torque them all with the engine rolled over in a little bit here. Yep, it's a rod. Notice the slightly taller, flatter side of the rod is facing against the cheek of the crank. There's another way to know we got it installed correctly. Look how nicely this turns. Oh yeah. Here's our first look at the domed piston sticking out of the block. Gotta tell you, I thought it would be taller. I thought this flat surface would be pretty close to zero deck, but it's actually not. Turns out the cheapest digital caliper in the known universe doesn't have the extension point thingy, so I can't just set this on the deck to compare. So I used a stack of feeler gauges, the smaller sizes there, to compare between the height of the piston, the flat area here, and the deck. Then I measured them with this. Looks like it's approximately 50 thousandths down there. Here's a look at the dome of the piston with the Felpro head gasket set in place. Of course, this is not compressed. It'll be a little skinnier than that once the head is installed and torqued down, but the top of the dome is almost perfectly flush with it. And here's why you want proper 273 gaskets, because that tiny 273 piston is absolutely dwarfed by this oversized 340 size combustion ring. All of that extra space between the deck of the block and the cylinder head around the piston is essentially enlarging the chamber and counteracting what we did by installing a domed piston. We would just be throwing away compression and horsepower if we ran this. Here's option B, which I actually completely forgot I had. This is an NOS Chrysler gasket for a 318. Note the bore is still a good bit larger than the 273 piston, but there would be much less compression loss with this. I stacked the Felpro Rebuilder gasket on top of the Chrysler 318 gasket so you can get an idea of the difference between the two. It's pretty severe, although again, even this one is giving up some compression. I don't know the final compressed height of the Chrysler gasket, but I can tell you the piston sticks ever so slightly above it, so I'll bet you it ends up a bit thinner than the Felpro. The best option for a 273 head gasket is a 273 head gasket. This is a used steel one, and yes, I did clean it off before I set it on my nice new engine, not that you can really tell. The fire ring on this has a funky shape. You can see it comes close to the piston up here, but then widens out down here. In that way, it's actually not all that different from the 318 style gasket. It is different in thickness, however. This is a steel shim, and it will certainly not stand as tall as any composite gasket. Just eyeballing that, it looks like it's about half as thick as the others. Now this, of course, is a nasty old used one, and somehow I only have one. If I had been thinking over the last year, I probably could have saved some more used ones, but honestly, used really isn't what I want here. If I could find a pair of these new old stock, I'd be really excited about that. The part number on the 273 head gasket is 2536757. If you happen to be hoarding a couple of these shiny new old stock, well, let me know. I'd really like to have those. Barring that, I think the 318 head gasket is going to be the next best thing. I have a little bit more time to figure this out because the heads still aren't finished, but sooner or later, I'm going to have to finalize this part of the setup. For now, I'm going to proceed and get the rest of the rods and pistons in place. Here's something I hadn't figured on. These aftermarket scat rods are a good bit wider than factory ones, and they barely fit through the 273 bore. Wouldn't it have been funny if they didn't? Now this might not work if you don't have the same level of chamfer, however the heck you want to say that, around the top of your cylinders that I've got. But what I'm doing here is just centering the oil ring carefully. You can just kind of tell it sinks into one position. And it's that easy. Now I'll take the compressor, squish these two rings, tap it down with a hammer handle, and then push it down to the crank. If at any time you hit that too hard, you're going to shoot the rod bearing out the bottom, so don't. With this style rod, there are no bolts hanging out, so you don't really need to worry about journal protectors. You do obviously still need to be careful as you bring the rod down to meet the journal on the crankshaft. I will say in some situations I've found the journal protectors, which slide over the studs, helpful because they can help keep the rod bearing in place. I think I've only knocked 2 out today, so that's pretty good. Now that all the rods are in place on the crank, it's time to torque them. Now these again are aftermarket bolts. They're ARP 8740s. The torque spec for these bolts is 63 foot-pounds, and again you do have to use the ARP lube, which I did. Might have also gotten some of it on me. So now I'm gonna do that with my fancy beep style torque wrench. I'm gonna try and do this pretty evenly. I'll go bolt to bolt and sneak up on that spec of 63. That's one rod. At least one commenter in years past told me that I should throw away my ridiculous beep style torque wrench. Given what it cost, I will not be doing that. And those get paint dotted so I don't forget I've been here. With all the rods torqued, let's see what we got. A nice spinning engine. No tight spots, no horrible noises. Part of my thought process behind using the 273 is the tiny bore with its teeny tiny little rings may have less resistance than a larger bore, a larger set of rings. I don't know if the difference in frictional losses will be measurable in any way, but it sounds nice. Next up, while the engine's still upside down, I'm gonna install our camshaft. This is a Mopar purple shaft. Someone in the last video's comment section said, shouldn't a purple shaft be purple? Yeah, they're not all purple. You'll usually just see some little spots like that. Anyway, this is a 508 lift, intake and exhaust. Can't remember the duration. I think it's 292 advertised. It's pretty big. Probably too big for what we're doing here. It happens to be very close to the D-Dart cam in terms of specs, so I decided it was probably a good bet for this. And I happen to have it. I've cleaned it up since the last video. There were a couple minor rust patches, so I did go over this with some brake clean, a towel, and then a brass bristled brush. You can see some stains here, but nothing patchy or horrible left on it. So now all I need to do is slather it in some kind of lubricant. And for that job, I'm probably gonna use this new old stock Mopar Camshaft lubricant. That stuff's kind of like, I don't know, caramel sauce? And someone out there is gonna be mad at me for not pronouncing that caramel. Oh, someone's been here before. All of the lobes are heavily coated with the caramel sauce. I've got a bolt in the front of this to help guide it in carefully. Also, all the bearing surfaces have engine oil. Now, I was told in a previous video that I should really install my camshafts first. And I understand that because then with the block the other way, you've got all kinds of room to reach up and support the cam. However, in a Mopar, there are windows right here, so you can just support it through those. And it's really easy. It's always a good idea to make sure your cam actually spins in the bearings, which this one does. And now I need to knock a woodruff key in it. I keep having to rob these woodruff keys off of cam cores. Luckily, I've got a few. Now, I've been planning to time this engine with this American-made Cloyce double roller through a adjustable set. I've had this in a box for a very long time, and I thought now would be its time to shine. Various parties over the years have recommended that I take a look at these. This is a timing chain tensioner that was used on 3.9 Magnum V6s. It just so happens that I have one. It's sitting here currently unused on the 340 for Dale's Demon. I will be rebuilding this engine essentially to factory specs, although, I don't know. I might keep a slightly wacky cam and a different carburetor. We'll figure that out down the line, but it's going to be mostly stock. I probably don't need this for this engine anymore, because I think its days of spinning to 6,500 RPM are mostly over. Anyway, I think we're going to borrow this for the 273. I've got the timing set off of the Demon now, and I'm comparing it to the one I've got on the box here. They're essentially the same cam gear. Obviously, the chain is going to be similar, although the coloration is a little bit different. The crank gear, though, is not the same. The one I've got in the box is a plus or minus 2 degree crank gear, and the one that was on the Demon is a plus or minus 4. Of course, it was installed in the 0 straight up position anyway, but we've got that as an option in case we need to offset this cam further than 2 degrees. The advance and retard positions were not actually labeled on this one like they were on the 4 degree gear, so I did double check those against some graphics on Cloyce's website, and then I marked it on here. The rounded one there is 0 degrees, the triangular one is +2, and the flat top stock looking one is actually -2. Here's that tensioner assembly pulled off of the 340 and with a layer of grime cleaned off it. You know, if this were just about any other build I've ever done, I wouldn't give a second thought to just slapping a double roller on it and calling it a day. But in this case, I really want to rev this engine to the moon. And so with that in mind, it's kind of important to ensure that the timing situation is as rock solid as it can be. This is actually why I was initially considering a gear drive for this engine, at least until I learned how much horsepower they rob. As you can see, this plate is basically shaped like the old school cam retainer plate, but then it has an extra section off of the bottom. There's a dripper that mimics the sheet metal ones Chrysler started using in later years. And then of course we've got our tensioner set up. This thing's pretty trick. It's got some kind of steel strap in here and then nylon on the face. Both of those components are somewhat flexible, and the springing action of that piece is what holds the chain tight. This just takes any slack out of the timing chain and keeps it from flopping around. If you've ever checked the timing on your Classic, you may have noticed that the timing mark doesn't always stay rock solid, especially when the engine revs up. Well, this will help to fight that. Incidentally, it's not necessarily recommended that you run these with a double roller style timing chain, and it's pretty easy to see why looking at the pad on this tensioner. You can see the little bits of the chain kind of dig into that. Now, I've done timing chains on modern engines that use nylon guides like this, and it's pretty common to see grooves like this on perfectly good running engines, so I choose not really to worry about that. Yes, the old chain dug into this pad a little bit, and the new one certainly will too. In the case of chain versus nylon on the tensioner, chain is always going to win. So the worst thing that's going to happen is a bunch of this material ends up scraped off and in the oil. If this engine were going to see 100,000 street miles, I would not be excited about this, but well, you can see how much wear has occurred from something like 7,000 miles on the Demon since it was rebuilt. Maybe it's more like 5,000. Anyway, the Barracuda is never going to do that many. In fact, it's never really going to do anything but an eighth mile at a time. So I think this is going to be fine, and I don't really have the time right now to go out and buy another one of these things. I really just want to get this engine together. Obviously, this component gets installed before the timing chain and gears. To install them, this needs to be compressed, and you can probably see this hole here. That is for a pin. The pin goes in this piece, and then you squish this, and then you slide the pin inward. This giant assembly is held in place using only the bolts that would have held the original cam retainer. In fact, looking at pictures, most of these tensioners only have 2 bolt holes. I'm thinking Dale probably drilled the other 2 in this plate to allow the use of all 4. I am also borrowing the bolts from the 340. The one has the hole drilled in it. So I'm going to put it here, and maybe that'll lead to extra oil coming down, hitting this plate, and being directed toward the chain. The torque spec for the tiny bolts holding the plate on, 210 inch-pounds, which is not very many foot-pounds, or pound-feet, or whatever. Anyway, there's that torqued. I'm going to have to roll this thing over at least a couple more times. I don't have an oil pump yet, the windage tray isn't installed, and actually I'm going to have to custom build a pickup to match the super deep oil pan on this engine. For now, it's upright, and I'm going to get the cam timing figured out. Kind of hard to see, but I'm pretty sure we're dot to dot. 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 Yeah, getting the chain and gears in place with this tensioner here, even collapsed like this, definitely a little trickier. Degree wheel is on again and set correctly, I hope. Did this using a dial indicator because I don't have any opportunity to use a piston stop here. I've got the cam bolt, the special cam washer, and the fuel pump eccentric in place now. I'm not actually planning to run a mechanical fuel pump with this thing, but I am still going to install the eccentric for 2 reasons. First, it spaces the gear properly to get this washer and bolt set up to work, and I'd have to modify the woodruff key if I wanted to leave it off. And second, just in case my brilliant electric fuel pump dreams don't work out, we'll have this as a backup. And now I've got another mag base indicator with a needle extension set in a solid 273 tappet, which is on the intake lobe for cylinder 1. Of course, these valves are in the exhaust, intake, intake, exhaust order. We always want to measure on intake for cylinder 1, so that's what we're doing. Somehow I did this last time without the needle extension. No idea how I made that work. Anyway, currently I've got it zeroed-ish. I'm going to record where 50 thou tappet lift is, and I'm going to record it on the other side as well, and we'll be able to check our duration there and use that to figure out where the center line is. Another technique here is bringing this thing up to maximum lift and then looking at the degree wheel. Silly me, I zeroed the dial at overlap, so I went off of overlap and then zeroed the dial. That's fine. 50 thou tappet lift. Watching the dial come around, it needs to make 1 rotation and line up at 0 again to be 50 thou lift. That is 12 degrees after TDC. Now we're going up. I could measure the lift here, although of course we know what it is. Again, the goal here is to find the intake lobe's center line. That'll give you the installed angle of the camshaft, and hopefully it's the angle we want to see. In that case, we won't have to do anything else with this timing set, but we'll figure that out soon. The main way to do that is compare two known points of tappet lift and do math between them. So I marked when this thing was at 50 thou lift, right there, and I'm going to do the same when it comes back down the ramp on the other side. I found 50 thou tappet lift from the other direction, and now I'm marking the wheel again. Now we have to do math. The first dot is at 11.5 degrees, really. Let's call that 12. And this is 202. So what we're gonna do is add those two numbers and divide by 2. Yeah, I gotta write that down. 202 degrees plus 12 equals 214 divided by 2 is 107. And this is why you use the degree wheel and the 50 thou reference point and then do the math. Because when I tried to eyeball the center of the dwell of that lifter, I came up with 110 and it's actually 107. 3 degrees difference is a bit. Now this is kind of good news. I managed to find a copy of the cam card for 4120233, which is our Mopar performance part number. The card wasn't in the box, which is really unfortunate. Their advised intake lobe center line is 108 degrees. Now, it was more recently than I'd care to admit, really, that I started finally understanding what these numbers mean and what they're telling us about what the camshaft in an engine is doing. So I want to kind of go over that, just in case anyone in the crowd is struggling to understand what the degree wheel is doing for us. What we're trying to ensure is that the camshaft is installed at the angle we want it to be. Now, the cam card from Chrysler gives us an installed angle, or an intake lobe center line, of 108 degrees after top dead center. What that means is we should find that lobe straight up, holding the lifter straight open and right in the middle of its dwell at 108 degrees on this wheel. Now I've got it set at top dead center here, and we can see that this lifter is coming up now. So I'm going to turn this until we find 108. 90, 100, 5, 6, 7, 8. That should be straight up. That lobe should be perfectly up. And it's really close, but you can't quite tell by looking. And that is why you use these two devices to figure out exactly where that center line is. I did go back and double check my marks, and I made sure to recheck the 50 thou on the downhill side, putting the slack of the chain the right direction. Because this is a brand new chain and it's sitting against this tensioner even though it's loose, there is no slop here, so the number was the same. Having double checked this number, I feel pretty good about it. I think it's accurate. And that 107 degree installed angle is remarkably close to the 108 degree angle recommended by Chrysler. However, I have been advised by a commenter knowledgeable in such matters that I should consider advancing this camshaft to an installed angle of something like 103 or 104 degrees. Advancing the cam is going to favor low-end torque, something we're probably going to be lacking with this particular combination. It will reduce top-end RPM potential a little bit, but the thing about that is we're using a small valve and restrictive cylinder head. So tilting the cam profile in this way may suit our needs a lot better and improve the torque curve in general. Of course, to get in that range from where we are, we would need to use the old gear I took out of the 340 and hope that everything lines up the same and we actually get 4 degrees out of it. So I cleaned and installed that gear in the 4 degrees advanced position. It's the next day. I've got all the things rigged back up. And what do you know? My first mark is exactly 4 degrees off of the last one. And same here on the other end. So I will do the math again, but I'm pretty sure I know what it's going to be. It appears we've successfully advanced this camshaft 4 degrees. 198 plus 8 divided by 2 is 103. So we've now got this camshaft installed on a 103 center line. That does put us on the low end of what was suggested. I could have used our 2 degree offset crank gear and put it at 105, but I feel good about it. I think this is going to be fine, and if it's not, obviously we can adjust this in the future. You know, I was today years old when I realized that the mag base actually works in 2 directions. Well, it's some while later and I've got this all buttoned up. I final torqued the bolt to its spec, which I seem to recall is 35 foot-pounds. I don't know, double check. I also Loctited that one. Seemed like a good idea. Now I do have the oil slinger or deflector dish for the front seal in place on this. I've seen in various engines where that does not clear a double roller chain, but it looks like it does on this one. And I like the idea of having that in there to hopefully prevent some extra leakage. So I'm going to run it. I also pulled the pin on the tensioner and it is now engaged against the chain. I slightly broke the pin earlier trying to bend it away from the degree wheel. In case this isn't obvious, the tight side where the crank pulls on the cam gear is over here on this guide that does not move. This one is taking up the slack on the back side of the chain. And this is how the cam timing and by extension the ignition timing ends up being solid because it's always held tight over here with the slack taken out on this side. I still don't have an oil pump, so I can't get the bottom end of the engine wrapped up just yet. I can get the timing cover and balancer in place, so now I'm working on that. Now to figure out what I was going to do for a cover, I had to make another decision. What radiator am I going to run? From the outset, I've been planning to use factory 1966 stuff, but that means using the early cast iron water pump and a radiator to match. I don't happen to have one right now, but I did find an aluminum one just like I put in my 68 Charger that I could order off eBay for, let's say, a reasonable amount of money. An eBay store called Auto City Classic carries these fabricated aluminum radiators. If you look real quickly and don't pay too close of attention, it looks like a factory piece. It's got a rounded top tank that mimics that shape, but it is actually aluminum. This one is painted black, which I like. It blends in nicely in here, and it can be a real job to paint an aluminum radiator and try and get it to stay painted. For the Barracuda, I'm gonna save 50 bucks and get the shiny aluminum one. I'll probably end up spritzing some black paint on it from the front so it won't be super visible from here. On the top, the tank will probably just stay shiny. Now that I've established that, I know I'll be using the cast iron style water pump. The cast iron pump has the lower hose on the driver's side, so it needs a timing tab over here on the passenger side. If you try to use this pump with the later style timing cover, the timing tab is obscured by that lower hose and it's pretty much impossible to see. Well over a year ago now, I did the cheapest imaginable engine overhaul on a 273 I was planning to install in my Valiant. I never did that, and recently I traded the block for a couple other 273 blocks in worse shape. This one was still a stock bore size. Thanks to that, I have all kinds of hardware here, and this water pump is part of that. It also has the sheet metal timing tab, which was used on early 273s. This style of water pump was used on Poly 318s, then on 273s and LA 318s, and even 340s until 1970 or so. At that time, they switched to the aluminum type with the lower hose on the passenger side and the timing tab flipped over to here. I need to use a timing cover to match this water pump. I also need to use the proper accessory brackets to use this water pump, which hopefully I do have. This does make a couple things easier. First, because race car, we don't need heater hoses or a bypass hose. And I can easily block these off because those holes are both threaded in this style pump. On the aluminum style pump, you either have to use rubber caps or come up with some other means of blocking those off. I'm going to use this factory pump because it looks really good inside and I don't think it leaked. If you're at all familiar with the aftermarket ones that are available today, they don't look right and they hit the harmonic balancers. So you always have to grind them for clearance right there. Now that I have that sorted out, I need to find the right timing cover. The correct one for this setup would have no timing tab at all. Here's one now. I got this from Evan at Rocket. It had a pretty trick race car aluminum water pump on it that I don't want to use, so I've removed that. I also started cleaning it and carefully filing all of the gasket surfaces so we have half a chance of things sealing. Note, it's had some custom lightening done. Obviously, I've got to replace the front seal here. You do that by taking a pry bar and a hammer and tapping a flat spot there. That breaks its hold inside the cover there. Then you flip it over, get a pry bar in this way, and just carefully tap it out. Woo! Woo! Again, further additional woo. Oh yeah, I forgot the bypass hole in the new style pumps is the wrong size too. So I can't even use this. Plugged, also cleaned, kinda. Time to install the new front seal with my handy front seal installer tool, which is actually just a hub nut socket. Tip, tip, tip. Yep. It's a seal. Now, I've never been one of those cover everything in silicone guys, but I have taken to using it around these water ports. And also, this timing cover gasket was like crumpled up in the box. So I'm using a bit there to try and hold it kind of sort of straight. I am going to coat this water pump in it because although it looks relatively clean inside, it's kind of corroded here. Will I probably regret running this pump in the near future? I always like to assemble the water pump onto the timing cover first, although it's a good idea to not torque these 3 bolts, top and bottom. There will be 4 bolts that go through both of them and clamp everything to the block, and it's best to torque all that together. I'll probably only have 2 of them for now. It's what I've got handy. Remember those custom windows in this cover? Why did they do that? It uncovers a pair of bolt holes that go into the crankcase. And this was the perfect time to figure that out. You know, after doing all of that work, cleaning it and putting a seal in it and getting it all prepped. Now I got to figure out how to fix that. And it gets even better because I need the balancer on to center the seal. And the balancer's in the way of that. I don't know. Fast forward to a chunk of JB weld or silicone or something going in there. Or me taking this all apart and doing it again later. Grease the inside of your harmonic balancer, or gigantic ridiculous fluid damper in this case, and install it with the proper tool, which is certainly not a wood block and a hammer. As you can see, a previous installer skipped the wood block. This is still not all the way home. I can't reach the factory bolt in there yet, but it was enough to center the cover on the seal, so I've got that tightened down now. I'm going to revisit this later. There are multiple things that annoy me. Oh, one more thing that annoys me, because this thing is designed for the other timing cover, there's no mark over here. But that's all right. That way we can make our own mark and we'll be completely certain that it's accurate. It's the next day, and I've decided how I'm going to fix that holes in my timing cover thing with some steel stick 2-piece epoxy. If you've never used this stuff, you just cut a section off of there and then mix it until the color is uniform, dark, medium-ish gray. Also, it smells, and I'm getting it all over my fingers. Holes plugged. Hopefully that doesn't leak. Balancer is all the way in and torqued, and I did scribe a new line. First I kind of scratched it in there with a screwdriver, pulled the tab out of the way, and then I just ran a file back and forth. That seems to have gouged it enough that when I paint this, it'll still be visible, and then I'll put a paint marker line on there and on the 0 degrees on the tab, and that'll be good to go. I don't really need the fancy different degree intervals that are included on these performance balancers because I use a dial back timing light. I pretty much paint all of my performance builds for myself Chrysler Industrial Red. This one will be no exception. Obviously, this fancy damper that used to have some kind of neat coating on it will now be painted. With all of that finally done, the engine's back upside down so I can get windage tray, pickup, and pan figured out. I did want to point this out. I numbered these rods and caps, obviously, but they actually have individual numbers that could be used to make sure these are identified and matched correctly. I don't know if those are serial numbers or what, but they're a 5-digit number and they're totally different between all of them. Here's the factory windage tray set in place. Recall these caps are shorter than 340/360 caps, so we've got a space from these shoulders up to the straps inside the tray that'll secure it to the engine. Now the good news is it doesn't hit. I don't have to worry about spacing it up to clear the crank. I just need to put enough washer in here to get this thing right up off of the block and tighten down correctly. I do also have to repair this thing. One of the straps is broken free. Yeah, that one. So I need to re-weld that. Need to straighten this out. There's a little dent there, but that's probably fine. I've discussed windage trays in a couple recent videos, but the basic idea is this helps cut down the amount of oil that's wrapped around the crank and flying around in there. This is supposed to be good for something like 10 to 15 horsepower worth of savings from reduced friction around the crank, so it's definitely worth installing here. As a refresher, I'm going to be using this deep sump small block pan. It's set up for 340, which means it fits our 273, and it does already have baffles, which is great. If it didn't have a baffle here on the back side, I would be welding one in right now. Even though it's got the deeper sump to keep the level of the oil down out of the way, under heavy acceleration, it's still going to slosh. It will climb up that wall and head rearward toward the back of the block, so you really want this baffle here in place. Adding a piece of sheet metal to use as a baffle or a dam is pretty much the only oiling system modification made to this 360 under the hood of Dale's Demon currently. And it seems to have worked. It hasn't blown up yet. Here's something I just noticed. In last week's Engine Wednesday video, I pointed out the letter marking system that Chrysler used on their blocks. That was to indicate to the assembler of the engine which particular size of piston to drop in. This one is marked with E's, and they're all the way down on the oil pan rail. E, 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 E. I'm not sure when they started using the paint markings instead of the stampings, but this is a pretty late 66 cast block, so a 67 model year, and it still has it. Oh, I totally just remembered. This is the original 273 block out of a 67 Coronet sedan I used to own. I traded it for like a boat or something years and years ago, and the next time I saw it was at Rocket Restorations in pieces. This is an American-made M72HV, that's high volume oil pump from Melling. And it cost like $93. It looks a lot like the typical standard pumps except for this goofy cover. It's highly recommended you open and inspect any oil pump you want to use that's used or brand new. So we're gonna do that. I'm no expert on oil pumps, but this sure looks a whole lot like the standard pumps I've been in. I have no idea what makes this different from a standard volume or what makes it worth an extra 40 however many dollars. If there were any build I wanted to use a high volume pump in, well, this would probably be it. So I guess I'm gonna put it in there. Hey, sure, maybe it was expensive, but at least it doesn't fit. Of course, the perfectly good, hardly used standard M72 I had in stock and forgot about fits just fine. I've known the whole time I would have to build or modify a pickup for this deep sump pan. I'm gonna measure this factory one and then measure our pan and see just how much I need to add. I think it needs to go that way, something like 2 inches. I'm not exactly sure where to do that though. If I do that on this angle, it's also gonna kick it forward at the same time, and that could quickly become a problem. So I may need to bend it, then bend it again, then weld a section in, and I'll have to figure out how long that needs to be. Here's an eyeball comparison between the current pickup and this pan. Where it sits now is toward the back of the sump, so extending it and moving it forward somewhat wouldn't be the end of the world, but obviously we'd prefer to pull oil from the back here. And here's an eyeball on the depth difference. This pickup currently sits about 7¼ inches off of the block. The new pan is about 10¼ inches deep in the sump. The angle on the existing tube hits on the pan really badly already. So that rules out bending it this way. If I start with this one, I'm gonna have to bend it this way. The area it's hitting, of course, is that rear baffle. It sticks out something like that. This is actually an original oil pickup from a Slant 6 powered truck. In the truck, they've got a rear sump, so this thing comes out of the block or oil pump or however the heck it's attached and points rearward like that. It's the same thread as a small block, it's the same tube size as a small block, and it happens to have some bends that would be beneficial. It's got the same pickup end on it, which as you can see is disgusting. If I use this thing, it's getting the world's most thorough cleaning. In fact, I might just take this entire end off and redo it. But anyway, the bends up in this section are almost, almost perfect-ish. Now this is still hitting that baffle. I'd probably have to either tap this down or maybe even slot it and make a spot for this to pass through. But I think what I could do is heat it in this section and bend that downward and try and twist that pickup at the same time. Or again, the other option would be to cut this, cut that one, and weld them together somehow. Welded up the pan, and now I'm going to mount it. That'll help us figure out where the pickup tube needs to be. I've got hardware figured out here. These are 4 1/4-inch 20 by 3/4-inch bolts. I'm gonna use 2 flat washers each to space the pan up, and then I'll put a lock washer under each bolt head, and I'll hit these with some Loctite as well. I recently took apart a 340 I'll be rebuilding in the future. In the oil pan of that engine, I found 2 of these little bolts that are supposed to hold the tray on. Don't be that guy. You can't reef these tight, but make sure they don't fall out. Anyway, because I have to space the tray down, away from the engine that is, with washers, I'm gonna use some red tacky grease to hold these in place on the tops of the bolts while I carefully set the tray down on top of them. It's not like this glues the washers in place or anything, but it's a little extra insurance for when you're dropping the pan on and getting the bolts started that you won't, say, knock them down into the cam tunnel and have to go dig them out. Hours later, here's where we're at. This is an A-body pickup, cut off. This is a brand new truck one I had in stock. Obviously, it's been around for a long time and it's kind of crusty, but it's never been run. I cut both of them. I bent both of them, kind of extensively actually, and now we're here. These 2 pieces together are going to make essentially just what we need. I've arrived at this design by first marking the location of the sump on the block here. This line is where the corner is cut off there, but I'm aiming for this area, so I shouldn't have to worry about that. I should be kind of here, which would mean the back of my pickup should be maybe there. This is angled such that the pickup is almost level with the bottom of the pan. I may still need to tweak that a little bit. So we should be good there. And I've taken a measuring tape and ensured that this is right about 10 1/4 inches, which is what we need. I'm thinking I should just weld this together, and we can always tweak it from here if necessary. They say good fabrication comes from good prep, and I've never been a pro at that kind of stuff, which is why I'm not a good fabricator. However, I have gone to great lengths to clean up these cuts and bevel the edges to give myself a nice area to weld. Obviously, I'm going to weld this very carefully because it needs to be oil tight. If it's able to pull air in through the weld, well, that would be really bad. I figured out the reason for this bend on the tray. The corner of it here covers one of the oil pump bolts. I scribed a line on there, cleaned out both halves as best as I could. Now I've got them set together with a couple magnets. Time for some tack welds. There it is, tacked in place. Somehow immediately it ended up tilted upward, and it's like 1/4 inch higher than it should be, so I'm gonna end up bending this some more. But that's okay, it's definitely close. It does fit inside the sump. Nice. We all know I'm terrible at welding, so we'll gloss over that explanation. I leak checked this with compressed air and some bubbly stuff. Nothing. So I think it's actually good. Going for the final fit now with the high volume pump, which I did sand lightly to get it to seat in that rear cap. I'm going to do something I don't normally do and use the gasket here between the cap and the pump. Mostly because that surface looks terrible. And I could go after this and file it, but, well, they supplied a gasket. Might as well put it in there. I also did something else I don't always do, and I put some sealing tape on the pipe threads here. Although you can hardly see it. It ended up buried way farther in there than I expected. But this is tight now, and I do have it a little bit higher than where it needs to be, so I can final twist it perfectly into position. All right, I did have to heat the bottom section of the pickup and tweak it forward ever so slightly, because it ended up further over here than I expected, and it was actually kind of contacting this angle. So where it is now, we've got all the bolt holes lined up, and I think it's like perfectly at the back, judging by that. So I'm pleased there. I think we've got about 1/8 to 1/4 of a gap here. I don't have any clay, or I'd actually check that, but that's what my measuring tape says. Of course, then we'll be adding in a gasket, so we're gonna end up with probably something like 3/8 to that pickup. Maybe I can tweak it this way just a little bit, but I certainly don't want to loosen the threads. I think that's pretty close, and again, with all the oil that's gonna be down in that sump, it's probably fine. Kind of amazed that's not touching, actually. This is way better than 3 inches below the bottom of the sump where we started. Obviously, this doesn't need to be perfect because race car. That's not the right bolt. Anyway, I am doing my best to clean the big chunks off of these oil pan fasteners and everything else. Fun fact. All right, it's not actually that fun, but it is a restoration fact. Cleaning fasteners like I just did on the wire wheel is not necessarily the best thing to do. It's possible to totally remove the coating from these bolts, and then you're essentially impregnating those surfaces with little bits of the grease you're trying to remove and little bits of your steel wire wheel. What that means is your bolts are going to rust. This is especially bad if you clean the threads that aggressively, because then they can corrode into whatever you're screwing them into, which is not great. The right thing to do is clean the crap out of them with, like, I don't know, paint thinner, brake cleaner, or something like that. Then sandblast your bolts thoroughly, and then have the coating reapplied, either professionally or, I don't know, you could try and do an oxide coating at home. Obviously, I'm not doing any of that. I just clean them as carefully as I can, and I will get some more brake clean. Give them a little tumble in the rag here, and then put them in. I also cleaned the pan thoroughly in and out and found a drain plug. I think this is brake clean can number 3 for this project. Maybe it's number 4. Ugh. Again, if this were a restoration, I would do things very differently. But it's not. It's pretty much universal to find that these pan rails are warped, especially around all of the bolt holes from previous over-torquing. That was definitely the case here, so I came through with a hammer. I've got the rail set on my steel table here, and I just tapped around all of the bolt holes trying to get those little dimples down. It's a lot better. There's still a big low spot here for some reason. This is just never going to be perfect. I will certainly be applying Right Stuff silicone to this gasket. Oftentimes I'll do both sides, pan and block. I really don't want this thing to leak, but it will make taking the pan off in the future a whole lot harder. You know, now is probably a better time than, say, sitting in the staging lanes to find that this pan is actually cracked around one bolt. Pretty obvious from this repair that this thing has seen a rod in its day, so I'm gonna go ahead and weld that up real fast. Fixed and clean. Again. I've had to repair and modify so many things on this build, including every single piece of this oiling system. Now it's time for everybody's favorite part, installing the rubber pan end seals. I might silicone under those. Anyway, note, they are directional. There's a big tit and a little tit, and those need to be carefully pulled through those holes. I did something I've never done before and greased those little things. They almost went in too easy. Again, I'm really not a silicone absolutely everything guy, but I make an exception for these terrible oil pans. Also sheet metal valve covers. Like I said, I really don't want it to leak. Look at that. So proud, so majestic, so installed. I'm sure this will come as a shock, but the part of this pan that was whacked with a connecting rod breaking and then welded back together was slightly bent. So I had to pry this rail outward in the middle here to get those bolts started. Then I was able to get that one too. They're all snug down. I will have to retorque this later. There are a couple of reasons for that. First, cork. Second, silicone. You want to snug it down, then let that silicone RTV right stuff cure. Then come through and final torque it. You don't want to squeeze all of that stuff right out, but obviously you need the surfaces touching for it to take its final shape. Other than mounting the 90-degree oil filter adapter, I'm ready to spin this thing back over and make heads happen. Except of course that the heads still look like this for some reason. More on that later. It's the next day, and it's time to go around and snug these bolts. Now there is actually a torque spec for these. Can't remember what it is. It's like 9 or 12 foot-pounds or something. I do not use that torque spec. When you do use that torque spec, you end up over-torquing the bolts and bending the pan. So don't do that. Currently, I'm just using my speed wrench. That way I can't get too much torque on these. I just give them a little snug. And I'm gonna do this a couple times. May even have to do it again later when it's in the car, because these bolts tend to loosen themselves as the cork compresses and conforms to the shape of the pan and the engine. The other thing you could do is use a very short ratchet handle. Again, the basic point is to just not get too much torque on these. You don't want to blow the gasket out or bend the pan, but you do want them to be snug. I do the same basic thing for valve covers. I won't use the factory torque spec. I just snug them, and then I snug them again later. And that technique has always worked pretty well for me. The end ones are really irritating because the little bits of rubber are in the way. Sometimes they'll even get stuck under the bolts, which is not good. It's a good idea to carefully trim the ends of those, but I didn't do that this time, and it did work out fine. I think we're good here. Getting my 90-degree filter housing cleaned up. This too is getting the file treatment because the sealing surfaces are not amazing. This in particular is a little worrying. This is after a good bit of file work, and you can see it's nowhere near straight. You need these particular gaskets to seal the 90-degree oil filter adapter. There's the surround paper gasket, then there's this cork section that goes in the middle, and finally a copper washer goes around the bolt head to keep things from leaking there. The replacement type seals that come in gasket sets like Felpros are not copper, it's just a flat gasket. And that's what was on here previously. Had to scrape that off. And I did find that this surface was pretty nasty from previous tightenings on the copper, so I filed that too. If I'd had a copper washer of appropriate size on hand, I would have used that, but I don't, so flat gasket it is. This is paper, but I think it's like steel in the center, something like that. There's the center cork piece, and this will go against the block. You can see there's a height difference between the middle there and the outer ring, and that height difference is matched here. If you try to use the flat style gasket, which is paper on the outside and then paper in the middle suspended by 3 pieces, that will not seal in the middle of this 90-degree filter. That's only to be used with the flat plate style adapters. The outer gasket, which is some sort of paper concoction, it's also multi-layer and it's kind of thick, gets set into the block, and then the housing gets set down on top of it. Carefully. You need to get the angle of this right. I think it's something like that. Obviously the filter needs to clear the bell housing area of the block. Here's a look at the oil filter adapter on my 340. Note it's pointed rearward and slightly down. I think that's pretty typical, but again, you need to make sure that the filter is going to clear the block here because this is angled slightly. As it moves, that can change. For some reason, I don't have a normal Mopar filter on hand. Kind of weird, but I believe this canister diameter is right. This position looks to work to me, so I'm gonna tighten that bolt down. I can always loosen it carefully and change this later. The torque spec I found for the center bolt was 50 foot-pounds, but I also found warnings from various builders who said that because that bolt is hollow, oil passes through it, it could break around there. So I just kind of torqued this down carefully to what felt about right, which was 40 foot-pounds. In a video on Just Mopar Joe's channel the other day, I saw him go around and carefully trim all of his squished out RTV. And I probably should do that, but, well, look at this thing. What's the point? Well, look at that. It is an engine, or most of one. There's not a whole lot more I can do with this engine until I get the heads going together. There is one thing though, lifters. We could have lifters, so let's do that. As I showed in the last video, this new old stock Mopar purple shaft cam kit came with these brand new tappets, or hydraulic lifters. And we know these are good because they're old. New ones, as you may be aware, tend to not be so good. I wouldn't hesitate to run these in an engine today. In fact, that's something we've done many times over the last couple years since discovering issues with popular modern brands, let's say. However, I mentioned in the last video that I have this set of good used solid lifters out of a 273, and I was leaning toward using them for a couple reasons. First, because solid lifter. At high RPM, we don't have to worry about these things pumping up or collapsing or doing anything else horrible. We can rely on them to give us exactly the amount of lift that we're supposed to have. Until 1968, 273s had solid lifters from the factory, and I would certainly prefer to run this way no matter what. Another issue is push rods. I have these nice chunky aftermarket 3/8 push rods for adjustable rocker arms that I was planning to run in this build. Hopefully these will go to the high RPM I want to reach. And they did not fit in the 5/16 cups on those hydraulic tappets from Chrysler. They do, however, fit nicely in these solid lifters out of the 273. To give you a visual demonstration of this fit, I drew a marker line in the tappet, and I also drew a line on the push rod. I'm going to insert this like this and rotate it. And as you can see, we get engagement through most of that cup, not down in the very bottom, but the majority of it. And on the push rod, if I can find the line, same deal there. Most of the tip there does engage. Now in operation, it'll actually be at an angle more like this, because small block Chryslers are weird. But again, because of the match between those ball socket sizes, we still get a nice engagement, and I feel good about that. I don't know if you can see that line at all, but essentially the line it's scribed is just about at the top of that tapered ball section. So again, we really couldn't ask for much better fitment than that. Now, there are a few things to know about running solid lifters on a camshaft intended for hydraulic lifters. The first thing to know is that I probably wouldn't recommend doing this for a street engine that's going to drive a zillion miles. But I have heard from other builders, including one located not far from me who also happens to be a 273 nerd and has put these same lifters on almost this same exact cam with great success. The mechanical cam has an extra little flat spot in its ramp up, which is supposed to ease the actuation of the lifter and reduce wear and noise there. The hydraulic cam is not going to have that. However, I've been told with authority that this can still work just fine. It might be a little noisier, but for our purposes, I really don't care. So I cleaned the crap out of these old 273 tappets, and I'm now ready to lubricate them and drop them in the engine. The biggest thing was varnish here on the ends. They didn't want to sit smoothly or happily in their holes without that cleaned off. You may notice little circular patterns on some of them. You may notice little tiny pits on some of them. Overall, they look pretty good to me. There's no terrible, horrible wear. No dishes or wiped lifters, so I'm just going to lubricate them and drop them in there. The faces, of course, I'll lubricate with our Mopar Performance Cam Lube, which apparently has the power to win. The sides will just get engine oil. Lifters, liftered. Of course, you always want to make sure these move freely in their bores, which they do. Well, it's days later, and I'm finally doing cylinder head stuff. Now again, I'm not going to show every bit of detail on this. I did a video quite some time ago about these heads and I showed off all of the basic porting stuff. I'm going to do exactly the same thing on this one. There are a couple small differences. I'm going to be using fender well headers on this thing, and I'm confident those will have the big port size of the 360, so I know I can do a little bit more on the exhaust side. There's a lip cast into these heads right at the top of the port. That's totally gone, and the lump here also almost completely gone. You can see now you've got a nice straight shot into the valve. I'm also putting in a little more time on the guide areas here, going farther back there. I really need to get some long neck burrs. I only have standard length ones, and that's kind of complicating this. The goal here is not to make everything humongous. I'm just trying to get a nice smooth blend. Don't mind the dying light. You can look over here at one of the stock ports and bowl area in particular. Look at that hard edge where it like jumps. I'm taking that out. This is just getting smoothed nicely, and I think that's going to be good. I've got the bevel on the exhaust crossover. I will weld in a small plate to cover that up. Now there will be a difference on the intake port end of the equation. I had no intentions of hogging these out to the larger 360 port size. I was planning to do a basic gasket match with the 318 small port gasket. As you can see here, it would just get opened up to there and the pushrod clearance would be relieved quite a bit, opening up the port and getting a more direct shot again. Unfortunately, I kind of have an issue with the intake I'm using. This Wyand dual quad tunnel ram is like the greatest thing ever. It's going to be fantastic on this 273, I hope. And even if it isn't, it sure is going to look cool. Still need to block the bypass hose connection. No big deal. I also need to delete this stupid chrome thermostat housing in favor of one that won't corrode through in a year. And this mess is just embarrassing. Anyway, almost as embarrassing is the port configuration on this tunnel ram manifold. As you can see, with the 318 gasket lined up there, it's almost exactly the same as the head. It might be a little bit wider and a hair taller, but it has a similar amount of overlap there, which I could have blended out. The problem is, this gasket is not currently aligned with the bolts. And when it is aligned with the bolts, the ports are here. Look at all of that. Look at all of that. Now, as you might imagine, the intention for this Wyand manifold was for it to be bolted onto a 360, not onto the smaller 273 318 cylinder head. And that makes fine sense. Here is that port compared to a 360 gasket. As you can see, it fits fully inside it, but it's certainly not centered in any way. Here's the 360 gasket set against the 273 head. As you can see, the port size difference is substantial. We would be taking a lot of meat out here to match this to this gasket, but unfortunately, that's probably what I'm gonna have to do. The only other option that I can think of would be to raise the port in the head and then fill it at the bottom. I'd have to do a custom gasket formed off of the Wyand and then massage that to the maximum 318 port size, but raised, and then put that same matching port on the head, which just seems like an insane amount of work for very little reward. I really don't think going to this port size is going to net me any major gains. In fact, maybe the opposite, but I do know that I need to have a port match between this and this. If I were to bolt these together as they are, as you saw, there's going to be like a 1/4 inch overhang where this port is trying to jam into this head, and that is just not going to work. I actually think raising the port position is kind of a good thing. Again, there's a straighter shot for airflow right to the valve. But simply increasing the port volume, I really don't think that's necessary or even the best. I do think it's probably where we're going though. Opened up to this size, there will absolutely be some shrouding from the pushrod clearance even after I'm done knocking it down. I think you can get like an 1/8 inch out of that. I don't think you could get that. We'll smooth it out as best as possible, but ultimately it's still going to be a restriction. I can't sleeve these and move that out even further because I'm planning to put a 3/8 pushrod in this hole, so I need it as big as it is. And I'm certainly not going to do anything crazy like relocate the pushrod. I'm open to suggestions, but none of those suggestions can be don't run the tunnel ram. We're running the tunnel ram. Obviously, I'm going to have a whole lot of hours into porting, bowl blending, and cleaning these up. But it's all going to be worth it, I'm sure of that. Another couple of operations I did on Mark's heads that I've done on this. Cleaning up the casting flash around the oil drain back holes to speed oil return. Again, I kind of wish I'd done that in the Valley of the Block, but it's way too late for that. And I've filed the valve cover sealing surface. These are absolutely embarrassing from the factory. And I've done my best here to smooth everything out and make it flat. I'm not going to say it's perfect. You can see a little bit of variation in file angles there. Don't want to talk about it, but it's certainly a whole lot better than when it started. I will, of course, be using the fantastic Mickey Thompson finned valve covers. Believe it or not, they're not flat either. So, yeah, this might all be a great waste of time. Maybe I could have these milled. There's a good chance I will be having these heads decked, partially to clean up the sealing surface, but also to raise the compression slightly. Now that I see where those domed pistons are sitting, I think this is going to be necessary. If I'm remembering correctly from the spec sheet, the maximum chamber size on this head is 62 cc's and the minimum is 57. Obviously, we want to be closer to the minimum for compression purposes. I am planning to CC the chambers on these heads, and I'll probably try and do the piston side as well. This is something I've never actually done before, but I would like to know what kind of compression we're working with here. Now, because of the domed piston, I'm going to have to do what's called a downfill. It'll have to be dropped in the bore a set amount so that the dome is below the top. And then when I CC that with fluid, the amount of fluid will have to be compensated for that downfill. That will definitely be coming in a future video. Again, it's nothing I've ever done, so it's going to be a bit of a learning experience. I know I need a piece of plastic with a hole in it that I can seal to both surfaces, and then a syringe with measurements on it and some magical fluid. Future Jamie problem. For now, I am extremely excited that this engine is no longer just a pile of parts in a bucket shoved in the corner. It's a complete short block with dress and everything. And soon enough, it'll have heads, a paint job, and then the glorious tunnel ram. I suppose that's going to do it on the 273 for now. We will absolutely be seeing more on this project in the relatively near future, and I hope you'll stick around and watch that. I'm certainly enjoying this, and with any luck, you are too. In any case, as ever, thank you very much for watching. And remember, making horsepower sounds like this.